The Ethics in Psychology podcast is created by my dad, Dr. John Gavazzi, a psychologist. The podcast deals with issues related to psychology, ethics, philosophy, and morality. He is going to interview people so that listeners can become better psychologists. Please enjoy this podcast.
Always do the right thing.
That's it?
That's it.
I got it. I'm gone.
Welcome to the Ethics in Psychology podcast. I am your host, Dr. John Gavazzi, psychologist, board certified in clinical psychology, and this is technically episode 22, podcast episode 22, but in the smaller schema of things, this is part 2 of postdoctoral supervision, ethics and skills for psychologists as supervisor. So this episode, as I said in the first episode, is not a standalone continuing education course. For continuing education credit, you will need to listen to all 3 presentations. There is not a separate CE for each 1-hour presentation. So in today's episode, what we're going to cover is the acculturation model. We're going to look at more definitions from the State Board of Psychology. We're going to look at supervisee expectations of supervision, what supervisees don't tell supervisors, and understanding supervisor limitations and enhancing supervisory skills. So with those thoughts in mind, I have back as my guest Dr. Jay Mills, and Jay gave his introduction last time. And we have our other guest, which is Dr. Sam Knapp. And Sam, would you like to say a brief summary about yourself?
I'm just very happy to be here with my friends talking about a interesting topic.
Okay. And Sam has been and still are, the professional affairs officer for the Pennsylvania Psychological Association. And welcome back, Jay. Thanks for participating.
I'm glad to be here.
So the learning objectives today are the same as the learning objectives before, so you can look at them very briefly, and they will also be at the end of the course, so you can evaluate us and how well we did on the learning objectives. So we're going to hop right into it because we have a great deal of information to go over in an hour. And the first thing, as I said with the introduction and the overview, we're going to be reviewing the acculturation model. Now, Jay and I spoke very briefly about the acculturation model last time, just giving a very broad idea about what the acculturation model is. And one of the authors is actually Sam Knapp, who's going to talk a little bit more about the acculturation model today. But this is one way to understand how postdoctoral supervisees are developing into licensed psychologists. So if you remember from the prior episode, this would be more of a developmental approach. So the folks listening out there can actually get the article from the internet. It's actually on the Ethics in Psychology site in the library, so I have a link to that there. But the acculturation model is based on the idea that acculturation is a process to change the cultural behavior of an individual through contact with another culture. So using psychology as the example, the postdoctoral supervisor plays a key role in this process. The process of acculturation occurs when there is an adaptation into an organization or society. In this case, we're talking professional psychology. The acculturation process can be complex. Some parts of a supervisee's belief system and lifestyle may be easily acculturated into the profession of psychology, while other aspects may not. The supervisee is already in the process and will likely continue professional development throughout his or her career as a psychologist. This is what I mentioned last time. You can put the acculturation model on a 2x2 grid, and what we're looking at is what the emphasis is, whether it's a decision-making process or looking at the supervisee's development. Are they doing things that are higher or lower on professional development, or are they using a strategy that might be higher or lower on personal skill sets? So what we have then is a 2x2 matrix, and we'll go over briefly what these 4 components are. So in the marginalized area, that the supervisee would be lower on both professional development and personal values and skills. So these individuals are at the greatest risk of harming patients. They would lack an appreciation for ethics. They're typically motivated by self-interest, and there's less concern for patient and patient welfare. Now, in the assimilated strategy, that the supervisee would be higher on professional development and professional issues, and then lower on personal values and skills. So the risk in this domain is developing an overly legalistic or formalized stance on issues and interventions as part of their duties. So in this case, a supervisee may rigidly conform to certain rules while missing broader issues. A separated strategy is the supervisee is using a lower emphasis or having less emphasis on professional issues and professional development, and having a higher focus on personal values and skills. So the risk in this domain or in this area would be that compassion overrides good professional judgment, and the supervisee may fail to recognize the unique role of a professional psychologist. And finally, we get to the integrated strategy or the integrated space, the integrated domain, in which a supervisee is both high on professional development and professional skills and high on personal values and skills. So there's an integration between their own values and what the profession requires. So the supervisee is able to implement values in context of what their professional role will be. In this case, the supervisee would be actively acculturating into the profession of psychology. So in a nutshell, gentlemen, that's the model. So Jay, we talked before the podcast, and you said that you gave this as a assignment in your supervision class.
I asked the students to look at the paper that described the acculturation model and then reflect on what that might do to the supervision relationship. And they had a lot of comments about supervisory errors and the role of the trainee. For example, they looked at how someone who is separated in their strategy might, the supervisor might be carrying a torch for particular issues and have that cause them to have a biased view of different supervisory tasks, and how that would promote mistrust and avoidance on the part of the supervisee. That's just one example of how they use each of the four cells to consider the challenges to the supervisee, which was interesting to me. I thought they would think about it from the supervisor's point of view, which they eventually did. But as they pointed out, if you discover a supervisor who has a inclination to be in one of these cells pretty distinctly, it raises very difficult challenges for the supervisee.
And Sam, being one of the authors of this, how would you apply this to supervision?
Well, this is a very good overview, John. And one thing about the assimilation strategy, assimilation is high on professional ethics and lower on personal ethics, is that in the assimilation strategy, sometimes the individuals fail to see the wiggle room that exists in ethical rules. And they take, as your slide accurately states, they take overly legalistic interpretations. It's good to obey the law, but they take they interpret it in the most conservative, narrow way. They can interpret it in narrow and conservative ways. And with the separation strategy, what happens there is that things which are virtuous in a personal relationship fail to be virtuous in a professional relationship. So, for example, in a personal relationship, it's assumed that there's a reasonable amount of self-disclosure, that ideally in a social relationship, you'd have about half the time would be talking about one person, half the time talking about you. Self-disclosure is about equal. If you had a friend who never said anything about themselves, you'd have a rather strained relationship. But so self-disclosure is virtuous in a friendship, but in a professional relationship, it's not virtuous. It detracts from the welfare of the patient.
Right. Now, one of the things that I was thinking of, and I would be interested in getting your feedback on this, is as I was preparing for this, thinking about how supervisors might use the acculturation model. And it could be a lens in which a supervisor views either the trainee's development or a decision that they've made or strategy that they did in their therapy. So, for example, Sam, kind of like what you had suggested was if there's too much self-disclosure, and they may disclose that, they may not, but if they say that I've been disclosing a great deal, you then could frame it not in a harsh or highly critical way, but using this model is to say, boy, that sounds like you were using a little bit of a separated strategy there. So, maybe, let's explore that. Maybe you were trying to be, what was motivating that? Was it, too much compassion that was occurring at that point, or what was driving your desire to self-disclose so much?
And I'll give you an example of how the ethics acculturation model was used recently. So a psychologist was supervising, had a supervisee who was providing in-home services to a family with a seriously disabled child. And when the supervisee was there, he saw the mother deliberately sit upon a kitten while the kitten was in obvious pain, and giggled as the kitten tried to squirm and get away. There's other instances of the family of insensitivity to the welfare of animals, of their pets. So the supervisee brings us to the psychologist and says, how should I respond in this? From the standpoint of the ethics acculturation model, my personal values is that cruelty to animals cannot be tolerated. The question becomes, in this professional role, what should be my response? In this particular situation, the child was being seen for aggressive behavior. The mother had complained that the child even seemed to enjoy inflicting discomfort on her. And the psychologist pointed out that this particular behavior appeared to be linked to the treatment goals of the family, and that the mother was modeling insensitive behavior and actually seemed to enjoy inflicting pain upon the kitten in a manner similar to the way that the child was misbehaving and seems to enjoy inflicting pain on the mother. And so because there was a link between the behavior, the presenting behavior of the child and the mother's behavior, even though it was directed towards an animal, it seemed like this could be fodder for therapeutic intervention. Jay, what do you think?
Well, it's somewhat similar to my students' discussion last week, and because they seemed to think that a trainee who was separated might enter the profession through a certain theme. For example, they wanted to become a psychologist because they were very interested in helping people who had been abused, and then they tend to see all of their cases through that lens, and they become then rigid in how they respond to what is presented to them. And I think that a supervisor who was watching this and a supervisee in the case you described would have exactly that kind of rigidity or compartmentalization, maybe, I'm not sure, that they would have trouble thinking about the rival issues. Because in your scenario, I think that anybody who's in a stage other than integration is going to struggle with how to respond.
I think people who are out in the profession, and this might be something for supervisors to role model, and this is something that I actually do, is whenever I'm confronted with a truly an ethical dilemma, I slip into an assimilated strategy first, which is, what are the rules? Maybe that's part of my Catholic upbringing. But this is stuff, again, you can talk about in supervision, but that's what I do, is what are the rules first, and I think about them, and then I think, okay, well then what might I be missing by over focusing on the rules? How does this play into my value system to ultimately get to what I perceive to be an integrated solution to the issue?
Right, and if you were approaching it from an assimilated perspective, you'd have a hard time freeing yourself to consider the different choices equally. But the way you described it, you can step outside one particular rule and think about what is the highest calling and which ones have to step to lower positions.
Correct, and I think that's all part of a developmental process for supervisees in training and about role modeling. So when psychologists are self-reflecting in supervision, this might be something worth disclosing about how they go about making ethical decisions or even clinical decisions, trying to use an integrated approach. So I don't think that individuals hear a scenario and automatically, bing, an epiphany happens and I have the integrated solution. I think that's all part of the self-reflective process about what do you go through in order to get to an integrated strategy or an integrated solution to the dilemma, whether it be clinical or ethical.
I think you're making a good point, and some of that can be extended even to decisions that some people think of as obvious. So if you have someone who you've assessed to be lethal to him or herself in a really obvious way, there is still, you're probably going to violate privacy for the sake of the duty to protect, but there's still a chance to think about, from a supervisory point of view, what is relinquished by violating privacy. So even though violating the privacy is a duty, in reality it is trumping another issue. Yes. And I think so you can talk about that scenario in an integrated way, even though the solution may be a foregone conclusion.
Again, why I use it is because it is a non-threatening way to help people self-reflect and actually give feedback. And
sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I think you're making a good point, because to me, when I'm trying to introduce difficult feedback to a supervisee, there's always the question of, how do I operationalize my concern so it's descriptive instead of sounding judgmental? And I think that the acculturation model, the cells there, help us think about what is it I really want to say to my supervisee, instead of just saying, no, that's stupid. If you were more advanced, you'd do it this way. Right?
Well, I remember you saying that to me, Jay.
Wow, it kind of stuck, huh?
Well, we're just surprised you listen to anything, John.
So anyway, I think operationalizing the challenge to a supervisee, if this can give it a jump start, that's a good thing.
Right, and I also believe it's a way that when they actually are doing a good job and it is an integrated approach, that's something you can give a lot of positive feedback for. And then on the kind of flip side or the opposite side, which is if they are exhibiting perhaps marginalized behavior, which we hope nobody in the postdoctoral role, it has a lack of appreciation of ethics. I'm sure it does happen, though, but that also gives a way to provide feedback, is to then question, well, what personal values were you using with this intervention, and what were you thinking about, like, professionally was going on in this situation? So it allows feedback, like I was saying, in a non-threatening and hopefully therapeutic manner for the supervisees.
Well, there's two things that have been said that I like, one of which is the emphasis on self-reflection, and the other is trying to be non-judgmental. And I'm always learning more things from students and workshop participants, and there's always new challenges, new perspectives that they're providing that influence me a great deal. And John and I did a workshop about a month ago where one of the participants talking about the value of social interactions used the term social nutrition. And I actually incorporated that in a workshop I did last week, slide on the PowerPoint, social nutrition. So in a way, being non-judgmental is a way to be nice to people, but it's also a way to defend ourselves against falling off our pedestal.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, any final thoughts on the acculturation model for this podcast? Because I think we need to move ahead with a couple of definitions here.
No, let's go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah.
These are definitions from the Pennsylvania State Board of Psychology and specifically for postdoctoral supervision. However, some of the things that we've talked about actually play in well with supervision in general. But for better or worse, again, this might be boring for people who are listening who these rules don't apply to, but we need to go through them anyway. So when doing postdoctoral supervision, the primary supervisor is a currently licensed psychologist having primary responsibility for directing and supervising the psychology resident. That's fairly obvious, as well as the next definition. The psychology intern is a student participant in an internship as part of a doctoral degree program in psychology or field related to psychology. And a psychology resident is an individual who has obtained a doctoral degree and is fulfilling the supervised experience requirement for license, or an applicant for licensure who is continuing training under 4131, which is related to educational qualifications. So psychology training is a psychology intern or psychology resident. And then we get into this secondary or delegated supervisor. Jay, we spoke just briefly about this last time, but the regulations of the State Board of Psychology have inconsistent definitions of the term secondary supervisor. One section states that the secondary or delegated supervisor has to be licensed. However, the regulations also state that the delegated supervisor must, quote, hold a current license, certificate, or registration from a health-related board within the Bureau of Professional or Occupational Affairs, or a person who is exempt from licensure under Section 348 of the Act. So this could include unlicensed counselors, social workers, drug and alcohol counselors, pastoral counselors, and others. And so, Sam, since you're the policy wonk of the group, I'm going to pitch it to you. Is there something that really needs to be elaborated in this part of the definition?
Well, these definitions are very boring unless you're in the situation where you are a postdoctoral supervisee or supervisor, and then they become very important. And everyone who's undergoing supervision or supervising someone should really get a hold of the regulations themselves. You can find them on the State Board of Psychology website. There's also a printed copy. It's in a green book. The regulations are in a green book, so it's called the Green Book.
Yeah, and I'll have a link on the actual podcast page to it. So
you can just Google Pennsylvania State Board of Psychology. You'll see a link that says regulations, and you can get them there as well. The inconsistent definition is something that PPA pointed out to the State Board of Psychology, and we got a clarification of them. The State Board is interpreting this in the most lenient way, the broadest way possible. But this points to the advantage of a professional association in that we have a staff person, an attorney who attends the State Board of Psychology meetings on our behalf and reports back on their decisions and interpretations. And so this is one of the advantages of a professional association, having those resources that's committed to doing that and being able to provide accurate information to people undergoing supervision. And it's several times a year there will be a conscientious supervisor or supervisee who calls up and they are greatly distraught because they can't figure out what a secondary or delegated supervisor is because they notice the inconsistency in definitions. And I congratulate them on being compulsive and explained that the more liberal definition is the one that the State Board uses.
Okay, great.
Would it be, Sam, would you say that you would advise a postdoctoral person to be careful of having an unlicensed person?
No, as long as they meet the as long as they meet the standards, the State Board isn't going to penalize anyone.
Okay.
Under those circumstances. You want to make sure the person is qualified. You want to make sure that they're helpful, but the credential isn't going to be a deal breaker.
Okay.
As long as it falls under the liberal definition.
And last time I think we gave the example of having a physician possibly be a secondary supervisor, so it could expand to many more different people.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, so in terms of hours and time, so the postdoctoral supervision must last at least 12 months and 1,750 hours. An important point to note is that no more than 45 hours of work per week, but no less than 15 hours of work per week for a minimum of 6 consecutive months. If there are 2 or more work settings, not the same agency, then the supervisee needs to get a minimum of 15 hours at each location and a minimum of 2 hours of supervision a week at each location.
And the State Board of Psychology has recently reevaluated that one, and the very last one, it might be changing. So this is this last one we're going to say, put a question mark by it. It might be changing, and people can call the PPA office and find out the latest interpretation that the State Board is using.
Good to know. In terms of content, 50% of the experience needs to be in diagnosis, assessment, therapy, and other interventions, supervision or consultation, and receiving supervision or consultation. The remaining required hours may be obtained by teaching with an organized psychology program, preparing practicing psychologists. Thoughts on that, Sam?
Yeah, the 50% in diagnosis and so on, in direct interventions. Important thing to remember is the State Board, correctly I believe, does not view this as face-to-face time. And it realizes that time spent writing notes, collateral consultations, contacts with collaterals, contact with referral sources, all this is part of a professional service. So in seeing a child patient, for example, you look at the records, you call the pediatrician, talk to the parents. I would not be surprised with a lot of children if for every hour of face-to-face, you're actually spending 2 hours of actual work on that child. And so you need to count all that time, the 2 hours, as working in an intervention, and that would count towards that 50% mark.
Time limits, hopefully everyone can get their experience within a 10 calendar year period from getting the degree, but the State Board of Psychology will make waivers on a case-by-case basis, including those for health reasons.
Yeah, and they've done that. They think they've been fair and reasonable about that.
Mm-hmm. And what does not qualify, and I think these two are important. One, the experience obtained must be consistent with the psychology resident's education and training, and no experience may be obtained where the psychology resident acts independently, for example, as a qualified member of another recognized profession under Section 3.3 of the Act. I know that on the listserv we've had multiple questions of people saying that they are licensed as an LPC but want to get their postdoctoral supervision. When they're in postdoctoral supervision, they are not an LPC.
Right, that's right.
Nor can they function that way.
Yeah, no, there's obviously overlaps in what LPCs can do and what psychologists can do, but they need to represent themselves as a psychology resident in order to have it qualify under the State Board of Psychology requirements.
Right.
And going to the first point here too, it doesn't happen very often, but every once in a while there'll be a psychology resident who maybe got a degree in experimental psychology, and they did not have clinical background in coursework. And it doesn't happen very often, but that would be an example where the board could deny the supervision. Now, a number of people in experimental will go through formal recredentialing programs, which is perfectly legitimate. And I know Indiana University of Pennsylvania, where Jay teaches, has done this a number of times.
Yes.
That's entirely different, because they do have the preparation, the coursework to go into the postdoc supervision.
Right. Okay, well, we're going to switch gears then and getting away from the requirements. So let's talk about supervisee expectations. And Jay, we talked a little bit about this last time in terms of the trust factor. Mm-hmm. I put a quote here from psychologist Christopher Peterson. There's an abundant reason to believe that optimism, big, little, and in between, is useful to a person because positive expectations can be self-fulfilling. And the reason I put that in is because we're talking about kind of the opposite sometimes with supervisee expectations. So the supervisee has expectations about the work, the responsibilities, and the supervisor. So some of the issues that supervisees have, and this is from some survey data, they want to make sure that the supervisor is competent in areas of practice, is able to supervise, directs supervisee learning, has realistic expectations of supervisee skill level, and acts ethically and professionally. So having read that slide, reactions, gentlemen?
I once did an informal survey where I asked psychologists about their positive and negative experiences in supervision. The two negative experiences were having supervisors who didn't show up or supervisors who fell asleep during supervision.
Wow. So
I tell supervisors that if you show up and at least stay awake, you're going to be above the minimum.
And I can say that Jay never fell asleep during our supervision.
I did not.
No.
No.
So that's good.
So I was okay, and I showed up.
Right.
So every time he showed up, he was awake.
That's right.
Yeah. If I fell asleep, I stayed at home. I think that what really goes with all of this also is trust and candor, in that the supervisor not attempt to be something for the trainee that they are not. And I think that really helps with supervisee expectations. You don't want the supervisee to have to use their clinical skills in negotiating the supervisor.
Good point. We spent a lot of time talking about the different roles that a supervisor can take, and I think a lot of supervisees do view supervision as a learning experience, and they really are looking not just for role modeling from supervisors, but they're looking for actual learning and growth. So I believe that, again, from some of the research that I've read, is that a lot of supervisees, because they're still in that subordinate role, really prefer a lot of direction and a lot of feedback, corrective or otherwise.
Yeah, they also, I think, this is not as clear, but I remember one of my early supervisors talking about Carl Jung's claim that if the helper, whether it's supervisor or therapist, is not involved in the activity and not somehow feels the impact of the activity, then perhaps the activity is not what it is supposed to be. And I think that it's important that the supervisor come to play, and that the supervisee be able to expect that they not just show up and stay awake, but really be there.
Right, and have some skills and expertise in the realm of supervision, which we spent a great deal of time talking about last time.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're going to talk now. I actually listed on this slide 3 journal articles, actually 2 journal articles and 1 book. And this pertains to supervisee non-disclosure and supervision. This seems to be a great topic, and it comes up also in some survey data as to the idea that supervisees don't disclose everything in supervision. So it's good for potential supervisors to be aware that their supervisees aren't disclosing everything that's going on in their work. One example of this, and we're going to go over several, that there are negative reactions to the supervisor, so that the supervisee experiences unpleasant, disapproving, or critical thoughts and feelings related to the supervisor. And Jay, I never had any of these toward you.
Or it's long enough now you've repressed them.
I've repressed them, that's right. So some examples may be that the supervisee views the supervisor as very narrow and rigid in theory and practice. The supervisor might be disorganized or is obnoxious. And the reasons not to disclose are deference to the supervisor, impression management, and political suicide.
This is a place where I think a supervisor can go a long way with a supervisee by anticipating things and blazing the self-disclosure trail. And I know that I was trained psychodynamically, and that influences this. But for example, let's say the supervisor was caught in traffic and was late, but unusually so. And I think it's a good thing for the supervisor to say to the trainee, you know, I know that my being late could really be an irritation, and I hope you can let me know if it was like that for you, so that these negative reactions, while they're still going to be filtered by the supervisee, at least have the chance of seeing the light of day, and any interference with the supervisory alliance could be minimized.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering how is it that a supervisee would be able to bring up some of these issues in supervision in a way that would be non-threatening or helpful as part of the relationship. So if a supervisee believes that the supervisor is disorganized, how would a supervisee be able to broach that subject?
My honest answer is I don't know, partly because if this is a chronic behavior on the part of the supervisor, then it's more likely to be uncomfortable. And I also think it's very difficult, unless the supervisor has a distinct reputation about which the supervisee has been able to learn, the risk is probably going to seem to be very high and might actually be pretty high. So I think that if it's possible, the supervisee could speak of consequences. If you don't turn in my evaluation, I'm going to get an F in practicum. This is for predoctoral. But other than that, I think that the challenge to the supervisee is a huge one.
Right, and I've worked with some students who are either in a predoctoral internship space or in a postdoctoral placement, and struggling with ways to be able to communicate that experience without committing political suicide. And
Yeah.
as we talked about last time, Jay, is that the supervisees are really in a vulnerable position.
They are.
And sometimes this might be one of the areas that might be very difficult for a supervisee to bring up. Simultaneously, you know, I still feel stuck on how can a supervisee do or engage in some type of behavior or say something that could be therapeutic or helpful for them.
I'm going to fall back on what Jay said earlier about giving feedback. He was referring to from supervisor to supervisee, but we can reverse it here. You can present it in a non-judgmental way and try and offer a solution and say, would it be helpful if I brought an agenda in? Would it be helpful if I know you're a very prestigious person with a lot of responsibilities. Would it be helpful if I gave you a timeline of when reports are due for the licensing board?
I think that positive suggestions are a good idea. I think that some of the trouble responding to your challenge, John, is that my perception is that there can be situations where the supervisee does not have good choices, and what they might have to learn is what can I do with a situation that is not likely to change? And those are supervised, unpleasant professional lessons that I think are a possibility in some situations.
Right, and that unfortunately might need to be the answer. And
Yes.
I think that one of the examples I gave last time in speaking with someone in a postdoctoral placement, the idea that you can still get supervision post-licensure. So just because your residency experience might not be the best, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the end of your learning.
Sure. That's a
So,
good point.
yeah. So then you can go to your post-licensure supervisor and say how obnoxious your pre-doctoral supervisor. And well, I'm saying that jokingly, but also saying, these are the things that really turned me off, and these are some of the things that I'm really looking for because I feel like this is an area of weakness. Not that dealing with obnoxious supervisors is a clinical issue, but that might be something that the supervisee can look forward to post-licensure.
Yeah. Go ahead, Sam.
I want to expand on what Jay was saying before, which is a very good point, is that what do you do with situations that are unlikely to change? And all of us have had things about jobs that are not real great, and we have to make a decision about is it worth the fight, worth the energy to fight it? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Take the example of an obnoxious supervisor. Is a supervisor really cruelly obnoxious and intolerable, or irritating as a part of their personality? And the disorganization, is it just so bad that your report's never going to get done in time and that you're not going to get credit for it, or is it just irritating? And if it's irritating, what can you do to minimize it? But you just realize that there's only so much you can do, and sometimes it's just not worth the energy in trying to change. I've seen it from both sides. I've seen supervisees who haven't felt very valued, who have been marginalized, and really conveyed that what they do isn't important. I've also seen supervisees who feel entitled and indignant that the quality of their offices isn't top-notch, or that how dare the supervisor comment on the way they wrote their notes. And
So it really depends.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this is just one thing for supervisors to be aware of, that many times negative reactions to the supervisor will not be disclosed by those that you're supervising. And maybe that also is a tip for the supervisors out there, is to say, hey, I'm looking for honest feedback. How are things going? How am I doing? How am I performing? What would you like to see different from me? But again, that needs to come from the supervisor, not necessarily from the supervisee.
Yeah, unfortunately, this conversation is probably being better attended to by the people who don't need to, because the erstwhile supervisor would say, well, how am I on top of my reports? Are my things getting done? Are there things that I'm doing? And if they are, then they can bring it, because I think that's one of the better ways of, if the supervisor can blaze the trail on that discussion, that's going to help it a great deal. But
Absolutely. A second thing that supervisees are typically not going to disclose is problematic or negative thoughts about self, history, health, lifestyle that may or may not be known in public, such as supervision. So examples are, what would people think about my kink lifestyle? Family of origin issues that make working with patient populations difficult. So working with alcoholics or sexual abusers. And what would happen if I disclosed my HIV status, my pregnancy, or other health condition? And the reason that supervisees don't bring these up is because they believe personal issues don't belong in supervision.
Well, I think this is a place where the acculturation model is really helpful.
Absolutely.
Because it's easy to announce the prohibition that supervision isn't therapy or supervision isn't blank. But the fact is, if you have a chronic or severe health condition, it's in all likelihood going to come into your work somehow. So how could one say that does not belong in the supervision. So if our sense of the boundary between supervision and other things is overly rigid, then important things that could be part of the scene will get neglected. And it's also part of remaining able to conduct your work, that maybe you will get a lot out of talking to your supervisor about how can I do my work while I'm caring for my ailing mother or something like that. Those are real things.
The personal, professional dichotomy is not always very clear-cut. The good example of problems working with certain patient populations, I'm teaching a graduate class, and a student has extremely intense reaction during the discussion of child abusers, to the point where a senior faculty member pulled the student aside and said, before you go into practicum, I want you to talk to someone about the intensity of your reaction. You will encounter people, even if you're not planning to work with people who have abused children, you're going to run into them. And you need to be able to have some kind of control over your emotions. And you don't have to talk to me about it, but I want you to reflect on that and get back to me about what you're doing about it.
Yeah, I think Sam raises a good point here also, that I've talked to some students who are afraid that they're going to get forced into therapy, or that somehow that's going to be ordered. And my suggestion to them is I think it's appropriate for a supervisor to say, you must work out a certain thing. The supervisee take responsibility for doing that. Now maybe it's a body issue, and they would be benefited from a yoga class as much as they would therapy. But the point is that they seek some assistance for it that's got real results, whether it's therapy or something else.
Well, I think you're right, Jay, that therapy can be abused and misused and misapplied.
Right. I actually think that some of these might actually be helpful for supervisors to know, not just in terms of, like a health status, like, at times I might, have decreased energy because of my fibromyalgia. I might not be on top of my game all of the time. So to me, that makes sense. I think that the other, bringing your history into the supervision, I think is also helpful. And again, it gives the supervisor a broader understanding of what's going on, not then that the supervisor needs to do therapy with the supervisee. The idea, though, is knowing that that's part of the history, and that might be an area of growth, could be helpful. And my final thought on this slide is I was talking with a Korean psychologist one time. She said that her workload was a little low, and I always suggest to people, because there's so many Medicare beneficiaries in Pennsylvania, I had suggested to her that, well, why don't you develop a Medicare practice? And her eyes got really wide and like panic-stricken on her face, and she goes, in my culture, we don't tell older people what to do. And hopefully I just didn't give an overgeneralization. That was a synopsis of a longer conversation. But there is a real a cultural issue for her in working with older patients, which, again, for me, I would never have known that. Now, obviously, I didn't know it because I made that suggestion. So those kind of cultural values also come into play in supervision as well.
Yeah, what I like about that conversation, though, is it sounded like she said it in such a way that perhaps the two of you could have gone on to figure out whether that prohibition was so strong that she couldn't work it out and go ahead and do what you suggested, or would that actually stop things?
Well, we had a longer conversation, and it was so culturally ingrained for her, and I'm not saying that's true for obviously all people of Korean origin, but for her, it was just a non-starter. And I think that was good for her to recognize her own limitations and boundaries for the work that she feels most comfortable in.
Yeah.
And I'm aware of a situation that I read about on a listserv where a postdoctoral trainee from Japan was in the United States and had difficulty with her supervisor, who had a very democratic, egalitarian supervision style, who says, I want you to challenge me if you think I'm making mistakes or missing things. And for the Japanese student, it was just not conceivable that she could challenge someone in authority. Unfortunately, there were some Japanese Americans on the listserv who gave some very useful suggestions about indirect ways that she could communicate issues to the supervisor without coming across as disrespectful of authority.
Okay, so the next area is clinical mistakes and emotional reactions. So supervisees typically don't share thoughts related to perceived errors, actual errors, shame as a psychologist, or feelings of being a fraud. So an example is, I made a mistake and I will try to correct it before my next supervision session, or I may have engaged in too much self-disclosure, but I don't want to be called out on a boundary violation. So again, shooting for impression management and wanting to move to the next level of training or earning the license is the reason not to disclose that.
Well, when I teach graduate courses, sometimes I have students write an ethics autobiography, and I'm very unimpressed by people who write stories about how wonderful they are and and virtuous.
Yeah.
I'm more impressed by people who talk about errors they've made, experiences, and how they learn. So I think the goal is self-reflection, and I don't want to making expectations clear. I don't want someone who comes in who does everything right. I want people who self-reflect. And we talk about the assimilation strategies and separation strategies. It's fine if someone has a good heart and they're willing to self-reflect. You expect them to work on lower levels of these strategies, but you also want them to think about it and reflect on it.
Right. And I'm just going to move on because I'm noticing the time. There's also evaluation concerns, and again, I'm going to read the slide just very quickly because I want to move to what I think are going to be some good slides to end up on. So there's uncertainty and uneasiness about the supervisor's assessments of the supervisee. So the examples of, I'm uncertain of how my supervisor sees me, positively or negatively. Am I doing well enough to meet my supervisor expectations? Am I good enough to be licensed as a psychologist? Part of this is impression management, and part of this is desire to complete the experience successfully. And Jay, we talked about this last time. Hopefully the way that Pennsylvania has it set up with the quarterly evaluations, that supervisees are getting a lot of feedback about their performance. But if you're not doing postdoctoral supervision, that might be something to think about, is how can I build in some evaluation so that the supervisee has an idea about how well that they're doing.
Yeah, I've may have said some of this last week, but I've argued that supervision is fundamentally a dual role situation because of this dilemma.
Yes.
And I think the supervisor can do a lot by introducing that at the very beginning and recognizing for the supervisee, look, I know you want my favorable recommendation, and yet I know you need to report your errors in order to make the best use of this. And so that can open the door, at least in the abstract, for a candid discussion about what that dilemma leads to.
Well, I think Jay's right. There's the evaluator function, and then there's a supportive developer function, and they are at times incompatible. And I think Jay's right that you at least try to be explicit about this tension that does exist.
Right. And all psychologists have negative reactions to patients, and so supervisees sometimes will not disclose negative, distorted, or disapproving thoughts and feelings toward patients being treated. Again, want to be impression management, making sure that they seem competent, kind, and caring. And it's important for the supervisor to role model and to say, right, you're not going to like every patient that you see. You may have feelings of anger. You may actually have feelings of hatred toward your patient. Attractive or romantic or sexual feelings the supervisor has towards a patient or parent of a minor patient, they may not disclose that. And some examples are, I'm attracted to my patient because she reminds me of a former lover, or this child's mother is extremely attractive and I fantasize about what it would be like to date her, or one of my patient's perfume or cologne is a sexual turn-on for me. And again, supervisees typically don't disclose this because they want to be seen as a skilled, competent professional who's not sexually preoccupied.
It's very difficult sometimes for Chinese to remember that we're human beings and they think they should be above it.
Right.
I think sometimes it's okay to let them know that, wow, I think a lot of people could have that reaction to, I don't know about normalize it, but let them know that this is not the first time it's happened, and let's have it on the table.
Right. And
I think the standard is any strong emotion that interferes with relationship, the quality of treatment, you need to talk about.
Right. And another thing a supervisee will not disclose is their attraction to the supervisor. So sexual or romantic feelings emanating from the supervisee toward the supervisor.
Mm-hmm.
And examples are, at some point I became sexually attracted to my supervisor. My supervisor is brilliant, which turns me on. My supervisor has all the characteristics that I find appealing in a sexual partner. And the reasons they don't want to disclose are they don't want to upset the supervisory relationship, they don't want to be seen as sexually preoccupied, and they don't want to be seen as unprofessional or provocative. So we're going to end up on why conflicts occur in supervision, and hopefully this will be a good place to wrap up section 2. But when conflict occurs in supervision, it might be a function of poor supervisor behaviors. So there may be an imbalance in addressing all aspects of supervision. There might be developmentally inappropriate tasks for the supervisee. There might be intolerance of differences from the supervisee. There might be poor role model of personal attributes, supervisor untrained in managing boundaries in difficult situations, or the supervisor might be professionally apathetic. So I know there's a lot in that slide.
This again starts with informed consent. I know I talked about this some last week. Students in my supervision class have as one of their writing assignments is to develop a professional practice statement. So they are clarifying what their supervisee can expect from them and what they expect from the supervisee. And while it's not an end-all assignment, it's a very clarifying exercise in how should this work, so at least we have as much as possible on the table.
Right. And I think that what we're going to do is move to the slides, as we're running out of time, recommendations to prevent conflict and enhance the supervision experience. And there's actually an article that I cite here, which again is on the Ethics and Psychology website. But some recommendations are that supervisors should receive more intensive training before providing supervision, and just as you said, Jay, so that you're aware to come up with some of these types of informed consent types of documents. Peer supervision for supervisors, particularly for dealing with transference, countertransference, and supervision, may help to avoid intentional abuse in supervision. Written informed consent for supervision. Training of supervisees on how to make use of supervision. So hopefully some of the things that we said today in this podcast might be helpful for supervisees to make better use of supervision. And since part of supervision is evaluation, have multiple people involved in the evaluation process, and training supervisors and supervisees in conflict resolution. And something that supervisees unfortunately can't do completely is avoid supervisors who are professionally apathetic. Again, that's a recommendation from the article, but I'm not sure that that's realistic in all situations.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so gentlemen, the hour went by very quickly. Too much information on the slides. Thoughts, Jay, on wrapping up hour 2?
I think that as you get more and more into this information, you see how it interconnects. Where we see, like the acculturation model to me connects a lot to supervisory boundaries and how much do you live this, and so to me, in the end, all goes to how supervisors really do need this training and don't have supervision simply be doing to others what was done to me.
And Sam, your final thoughts?
Self-reflection.
That's a good final thought. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much. Jay, I'm gonna thank you profusely as you're at the end of your assistance with me. So thank you for joining us.
I was glad to be here with both of you.
And I greatly appreciate, Sam, your help in not only today's podcast but helping to organize this material. You've been a great partner to work with on this task. So for the listeners out there, until the next time, do the right thing.